So it is my honor to introduce to you our speaker for today. He is a professor of theology, teaching both undergraduates and graduates here at St. John's and at the College of St. Ben's. He received his Master's of Divinity right here from St. John's in 1979, just yesterday, and his doctorate from the Catholic University of America in 1987. He also served as the rector here at St. John's from in 92 to 97, and also served as our dean of the School of Theology from 89 to 99, and is currently playing that role again as the interim dean during the dean's recovery. He has several writings, several books out that include, this first one is really a tough one for me, so bear with me. Piety in Politics, The Dynamics of Royal Authority in Homeric Greece, Biblical Israel, and Old Babylonian Mesopotamia. Come on, right? Great titles. Spirit and Reason, The Embodied Character of Ezekiel's Thinking. Celibacy in the Ancient World, which is actually out on the table I saw if you want to purchase that. And he is currently working on a 2-volume commentary on the book of Ezekiel. This man is very busy, and he has honored us today to do this Theology Day. So please join me in welcoming Father Dale Launderville.
Well, thank you. It's great to see all of you here. I have to get all these gadgets going here. I think I've got it. Okay. All right. So our topic for today, as you all know, is global warming. Who is to blame? A prophetic view of collective responsibility. So as you realize, it's the Old Testament that I'm coming out of, so that's my expertise, and I'm intruding into the area of scientists. So all of you, or many of you out there, probably know a lot more about the scientific aspects of this, so feel free to chime in or to object or whatever, so that we at least draw a little bit closer to the truth on this. Okay? So I would like to start with a prayer from Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Laudato Si. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists and pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey upon it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, and to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. So, as I had the little aerial view, a favorite picture of mine, actually it's one of the things that drew me to St. John's. My first year of college was actually in urban St. Louis, at St. Louis University. Probably a wonderful place, but I was a farm kid. And I needed some trees or some green around, which was not there. So I had this aerial photo on the wall of my dorm room that almost all of that first year. The next year I was here. So it's it kind of tells a good story for me. on that aerial photo, of course, you can see Stella Maris clear in the background. But here, what I like about that picture is it actually brings together culture and nature in a very important way. And so if we think of just the landscape around there, the ecological environment, what are the species that are there that we probably pay little or no attention to? But somehow that coming together of culture and nature, that balance is crucial for our survival on the planet, that somehow we've got to get this right. And the warning signs is that we haven't been doing so very, very well the past 400 or 500 years. So this is one of my college friends that I was in college with, was here a year ago, September, and he actually wrote this little reflection. He had done a little trip out to Stella Maris. So he said the day defined the word idyllic, which it can be in September. Temperature was in the lower 60s, low humidity, only wisps of clouds and a slight breeze. And as I walked along, I was transported back to my first visit to St. John's in the fall of 1968, now 46 years ago, and recalled the cognition of what I have come to know as the sense of place. And only rarely does reality live up to memory, but it did in this case. And as I step piled on step, I remarked to myself how extraordinary it is that this chunk of land can still evoke the same sensation of calm and purpose almost a half century later. So in our own ways, in our own places, I'm sure we've all had that kind of experience of beauty that took us to another level of how we're really joined with all that's around us. So Pope Francis, in his important encyclical, he quotes the Greek Orthodox patriarch Bartholomew, who was saying, "We are called to accept the world as a sacrament of communion, where human and divine meet even in the slightest detail in the seamless garment of God's creation." So that sense of communion with all things, how crucial that is to our living on this planet. One of my other college classmates is here today. Roger, you actually called my attention to the fact that there's an important distinction between global warming and climate change. And I'm going to put the two together here. So this little cartoon maybe will help clarify this. So you have the diagnosis on the clipboard, the symptoms. There's global warming, but then melting ice, higher seas, heavier rain. She says, your results are back. It's climate change. Just how many greenhouse gases have you been consuming? So clearly there's a cause and effect here. So one of the important causes of the changing climate is actually greenhouse gases. And the temperature has been rising. What I found interesting is that in the American, down in the South, probably what we call the deep South, it's white, which kind of indicates they really haven't changed in temperature a whole lot. But as you head up towards Canada, it's red. So their temperatures have really markedly increased in that. But at any rate, this is the change from the 20th century, 1900 up to 2014. So the magnitude of this problem of global warming it's indicated by this quote that I take from Michael Northcott, in which he says the annual exports of coal from Indonesia, Australia, Vietnam, Russia, Canada, and the US were 2.1 million metric tons in 2000. But in 2010, this number increased to 176 million metric tons, with 100 million from Indonesia and Australia alone. So the issue here, clearly it weighs in on the developing countries that are actually using lots of electricity. That's where the coal is basically going, is for all the when power goes out, we're pretty well immobilized. You don't go anywhere. And so that important power source, a lot of that is being fueled by fossil fuels, of which coal is the main one. And so the last part of his quote, if burning this quantity of coal continues from 2020 to 2030, which is not that far away, the planet will be moved into an unstoppable warming event in which temperatures will rise in the next 50 years in excess of 3, 4, 5, or even 6 degrees Celsius. And even where we're at now, the meteorologist Paul Douglas was giving a presentation down at the the Minnesota Catholic Conference back in September. And he made the comment that, if you have a temperature of like 101 or 2, you don't feel very well. And so if we think that the threshold that they're trying to keep the atmosphere from rising is 2 degrees Celsius, and so and that's in Celsius, which is not Fahrenheit. But if it rises just a couple of degrees, you know what it's doing to the environment or the planet. If we feel miserable at 2 and really danger when it goes a little bit higher, you can see how the issue is really significant. But as we all know, there's a real denial that this is an issue. And back in 2009, they've been having these climate summits for a number of years, but there was a theft of emails from the Climate Research Unit of the University of East Anglia during the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. And scientists said there was really no truth to the allegations, that they had distorted the data, made it look like global warming is a big issue when it was really a conspiracy to try and undercut the way we get our energy. But this other scientist said that was not true. But what happened is that was a media event. So in 2006, before that happened, there was 70% of Americans thought that climate change was a serious problem. In 2010, the year after this media event, it was only 48% of Americans thought climate change was, and they thought it was greatly exaggerated at that point. So a real dramatic shift at that point. But what happened then, if you remember Superstorm Sandy out in the East Coast, that sort of caught the attention of people. And so that, plus other extreme weather events, which are really ramping up in the last 10 years, and we know that just from hearing about tornadoes or cyclones or hurricanes, that the intensity of these is really much stronger than previously. And so these events back in 2012 shifted American opinion back again, that climate is a serious problem. But the next line, I think, is really troubling. But the majority of Americans believe that nothing can be done about it. It's a tough problem, but if that's the case, then that's what I want to talk about. Well, so recently, just in October of this year, in the National Geographic, there's an article by Susan Goldberg, I think is the editor of this. She says, while some leading presidential candidates continue to question the science and impact of climate change, recent polls show that 3/4 of Americans now acknowledge that climate change is happening. So to be a believer in this, 3/4 and gaining. So if you think of rather than being immobilized by this and we can't do anything at all, what we get from a number of authors, and it clearly comes through in Pope Francis's encyclical, is that to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases means to reduce consumption. And so Pope Francis says, humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production and consumption in order to combat this warning, or at least the human causes which may, this warming, which at least address the human causes which produce or aggravate this. So this is where I think it hits home, is that it has to be a collective effort, and it has to be global. Because as you noticed in that slide that talked about where the coal is coming from, it's not just coming from the American West, Wyoming, where a lot of it is truly coming from in this country, but globally, China surpassed the US in 2007 for greenhouse gas emissions as the main emitter at that point. To their credit, though, they actually are they're making at least significant steps towards green energy in their, but nevertheless, their problem, obviously, if you've ever been there, wow, the smog is just a nice bright day like this. Back in 1995, I actually got to go to Shanghai, and it was a day like this. We were in the city, but it was overcast. We drove outside of the city, and all of a sudden the sun started showing up. And they said, no, it was the pollution that was doing this.
We're making all our products so we can buy them.
There you go. That's exactly right. So it's again, if it comes back to the consumption, we're implicated in why they are producing these things and that. Yeah, great. Okay, so the problem which I'm posing here, which I think a lot of the literature is saying this, it's of catastrophic proportions. If you get up into 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius in the warming, we're in real trouble. But probable responses: 1, we can deny it. Number 2, we can claim that we are victims of this, that little me, I didn't do anything. I inherited this. It came, the whole system was here, and I fed into it. So don't blame me. The third response, which I hope we can look at, is search for ways of finding a constructive solution in this. So this is where I get to jump into Ezekiel. So I get to take you way back. But the reason why I'm using him, one part is that I know a little bit more about him, but the other reason is that the time of Ezekiel was time in which the community suffered a major catastrophe. The leaders were taken out of the land. All their institutional setup was just leveled, and they were subjugated to an invading army. So if we were taken over by Russia or Chinese or Canadians maybe, and they come in and take us over, and the trauma that you would go through as a result of that. So he's actually dealing with this. But here's when he's looking forward in a visionary way to when that actually shows up. And this is probably as close as we get, I think, to the actual historical Ezekiel and to get inside of his skin. A lot of the rest of the book may actually be reflection on him, what he was like, etc. But this one, the emotion is strong and confusing. So as you, Son of Man, groan, as for you, Son of Man, groan, with shattered loins and bitter grief, groan in their sight. When they ask you, why are you groaning? You shall say, because of what I heard. When it comes, every heart shall melt, and every hand shall fall helpless, and every spirit will grow faint, and every knee run with water. See, it is coming, it is here, oracle of the Lord God. So he was commissioned to go out and simply make that kind of statement. And you can imagine how that was received in terms of his dire prediction at that point. So at the very beginning of the book, where they try and say, how did he know that he was called to do this? And Ezekiel's call is that he's actually being sent to a nation of rebels. So this is the Lord speaking. They, as well as their fathers, have defied me to this very day. For the sons are brazen of face and stubborn of heart. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord, whether they listen or not, for they are a rebellious breed, that they may know that there was a prophet among them. So what he's being steeled up for is that you're going to get rejected. You're going to say this, they're going to reject you, but you have to say it anyway. And Ezekiel is a human being, so he's probably, Jeremiah screamed out against God when he sent him on a tough mission, and he kept saying, God, why did you do this? Why did you set me up so that I end up being someone who's rejected, and everything I do really comes back upon me? And so he said, you duped me. That's Jeremiah. Maybe God, I don't know this, but maybe God.
So it is my honor to introduce to you our speaker for today. He is a professor of theology, teaching both undergraduates and graduates here at St. John's and at the College of St. Ben's. He received his Master's of Divinity right here from St. John's in 1979, just yesterday, and his doctorate from the Catholic University of America in 1987. He also served as the rector here at St. John's from in 92 to 97, and also served as our dean of the School of Theology from 89 to 99, and is currently playing that role again as the interim dean during the dean's recovery. He has several writings, several books out that include, this first one is really a tough one for me, so bear with me. Piety and Politics, The Dynamics of Royal Authority in Homeric Greece, Biblical Israel, and Old Babylonian Mesopotamia. Come on, right? Great titles. Spirit and Reason, The Embodied Character of Ezekiel's Thinking. Celibacy in the Ancient World, which is actually out on the table I saw if you want to purchase that. And he is currently working on a 2-volume commentary on the book of Ezekiel. This man is very busy, and he has honored us today to do this Theology Day. So please join me in welcoming Father Dale Launderville.
Well, thank you. It's great to see all of you here. I have to get all these gadgets going here. I think I've got it. Okay. All right. So our topic for today, as you all know, is global warming. Who is to blame? A prophetic view of collective responsibility. So as you realize, it's the Old Testament that I'm coming out of, so that's my expertise, and I'm intruding into the area of scientists. So all of you, or many of you out there, probably know a lot more about the scientific aspects of this, so feel free to chime in or to object or whatever, so that we at least draw a little bit closer to the truth on this. Okay? So I would like to start with a prayer from Pope Francis's latest encyclical, Laudato Si. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists and pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey upon it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, and to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. So, as I had the little aerial view, a favorite picture of mine, actually it's one of the things that drew me to St. John's. My first year of college was actually in urban St. Louis at St. Louis University. Probably a wonderful place, but I was a farm kid. And I needed some trees or some green around, which was not there. So I had this aerial photo on the wall of my dorm room that almost all of that first year. The next year I was here. So it's it kind of tells a good story for me. On that aerial photo, of course, you can see Stella Maris clear in the background. But here, what I like about that picture is it actually brings together culture and nature in a very important way. And so if we think of just the landscape around there, the ecological environment, what are the species that are there that we probably pay little or no attention to? But somehow that coming together of culture and nature, that balance is crucial for our survival on the planet, that somehow we've got to get this right. And the warning signs is that we haven't been doing so very, very well the past 400 or 500 years. So this is one of my college friends that I was in college with, was here a year ago, September, and he actually wrote this little reflection. He had done a little trip out to Stella Maris. So he said the day defined the word idyllic, which it can be in September. Temperature was in the lower 60s, low humidity, only wisps of clouds and a slight breeze. And as I walked along, I was transported back to my first visit to St. John's in the fall of 1968, now 46 years ago, and recalled the cognition of what I have come to know as the sense of place. And only rarely does reality live up to memory, but it did in this case. And as I step piled on step, I remarked to myself how extraordinary it is that this chunk of land can still evoke the same sensation of calm and purpose almost a half century later. So in our own ways, in our own places, I'm sure we've all had that kind of experience of beauty that took us to another level of how we're really joined with all that's around us. So Pope Francis, in his important encyclical, he quotes the Greek Orthodox patriarch Bartholomew, who was saying, "We are called to accept the world as a sacrament of communion, where human and divine meet even in the slightest detail in the seamless garment of God's creation." So that sense of communion with all things, how crucial that is to our living on this planet. One of my other college classmates is here today. Roger, you actually called my attention to the fact that there's an important distinction between global warming and climate change. And I'm going to put the two together here. So this little cartoon maybe will help clarify this. So you have the diagnosis on the clipboard, the symptoms. There's global warming, but then melting ice, higher seas, heavier rain. She says, your results are back. It's climate change. Just how many greenhouse gases have you been consuming? So clearly there's a cause and effect here. So one of the important causes of the changing climate is actually greenhouse gases. And the temperature has been rising. What I found interesting is that in the American, down in the South, probably what we call the Deep South, it's white, which kind of indicates they really haven't changed in temperature a whole lot. But as you head up towards Canada, it's red. So their temperatures have really markedly increased in that. But at any rate, this is the change from the 20th century, 1900 up to 2014. So the magnitude of this problem of global warming it's indicated by this quote that I take from Michael Northcott, in which he says the annual exports of coal from Indonesia, Australia, Vietnam, Russia, Canada, and the US were 2.1 million metric tons in 2000. But in 2010, this number increased to 176 million metric tons, with 100 million from Indonesia and Australia alone. So the issue here, clearly it weighs in on the developing countries that are actually using lots of electricity. That's where the coal is basically going, is for all the when power goes out, we're pretty well immobilized. You don't go anywhere. And so that important power source, a lot of that is being fueled by fossil fuels, of which coal is the main one. And so the last part of his quote, if burning this quantity of coal continues from 2020 to 2030, which is not that far away, the planet will be moved into an unstoppable warming event in which temperatures will rise in the next 50 years in excess of 3, 4, 5, or even 6 degrees Celsius. And even where we're at now, the meteorologist Paul Douglas was giving a presentation down at the the Minnesota Catholic Conference back in September. And he made the comment that, if you have a temperature of like 101 or 2, you don't feel very well. And so if we think that the threshold that they're trying to keep the atmosphere from rising is 2 degrees Celsius, and so and that's in Celsius, which is not Fahrenheit, but if it rises just a couple of degrees, you know what it's doing to the environment or the planet. If we feel miserable at 2 and really danger when it goes a little bit higher, you can see how the issue is really significant. But as we all know, there's a real denial that this is an issue. And back in 2009, they've been having these climate summits for a number of years, but there was a theft of emails from the Climate Research Unit of the University of East Anglia during the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. And scientists said there was really no truth to the allegations, that they had distorted the data, made it look like global warming is a big issue when it was really a conspiracy to try and undercut the way we get our energy. But this other scientist said that was not true. But what happened is that was a media event. So in 2006, before that happened, there was 70% of Americans thought that climate change was a serious problem. In 2010, the year after this media event, it was only 48% of Americans thought climate change was, and they thought it was greatly exaggerated at that point. So a real dramatic shift at that point. But what happened then, if you remember Superstorm Sandy out the East Coast, that sort of caught the attention of people. And so that, plus other extreme weather events, which are really ramping up in the last 10 years, and we know that just from hearing about tornadoes or cyclones or hurricanes, that the intensity of these is really much stronger than previously. And so these events back in 2012 shifted American opinion back again, that climate is a serious problem. But the next line, I think, is really troubling. But the majority of Americans believe that nothing can be done about it. It's a tough problem, but if that's the case, then that's what I want to talk about. Well, so recently, just in October of this year, in the National Geographic, there's an article by Susan Goldberg, I think is the editor of this. She says, while some leading presidential candidates continue to question the science and impact of climate change, recent polls show that 3/4 of Americans now acknowledge that climate change is happening. So to be a believer in this, 3/4 and gaining. So if you think of rather than being immobilized by this and we can't do anything at all, what we get from a number of authors, and it clearly comes through in Pope Francis's encyclical, is that to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases means to reduce consumption. And so Pope Francis says, humanity is called to recognize the need for changes of lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which make this warming, which at least address the human causes which produce or aggravate this. So this is where I think it hits home, is that it has to be a collective effort and it has to be global. Because as you noticed in that slide that talked about where the coal is coming from, it's not just coming from the American West, Wyoming, where a lot of it is truly coming from in this country, but globally, China surpassed the US in 2007 for greenhouse gas emissions as the main emitter at that point. To their credit, though, they actually they're making at least significant steps towards green energy in their, but nevertheless, their problem, obviously, if you've ever been there, wow, the smog is just a nice bright day like this. Back in 1995, I actually got to go to Shanghai, and it was a day like this. We were in the city, but it was overcast. We drove outside of the city, and all of a sudden the sun started showing up. And they said, no, it was the pollution that was doing this.
They're making all our products so we can buy them.
There you go. That's exactly right. So it's again, if it comes back to the consumption, we're implicated in why they are producing these things and that. Yeah, great. Okay, so the problem which I'm posing here, which I think a lot of the literature is saying this, it's of catastrophic proportions. If you get up into 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius in the warming, we're in real trouble. But probable responses: 1, we can deny it. Number 2, we can claim that we are victims of this, that little me, I didn't do anything. I inherited this. It came, the whole system was here and I fed into it. Don't blame me. The third response, which I hope we can look at, is search for ways of finding a constructive solution in this. So this is where I get to jump into Ezekiel. So I get to take you way back. But the reason why I'm using him, one part is that I know a little bit more about him, but the other reason is that the time of Ezekiel was a time in which the community suffered a major catastrophe. The leaders were taken out of the land. All their institutional setup was just leveled, and they were subjugated to an invading army. So if we were taken over by Russia or Chinese or Canadians maybe, and they come in and take us over, and the trauma that you would go through as a result of that. So he's actually dealing with this. But here's when he's looking forward in a visionary way to when that actually shows up. And this is probably as close as we get, I think, to the actual historical Ezekiel and to get inside of his skin. A lot of the rest of the book may actually be reflection on him, what he was like, etc. But this one, the emotion is strong and confusing. So as you, Son of Man, groan, as for you, Son of Man, groan, with shattered loins and bitter grief, groan in their sight. When they ask you, why are you groaning? You shall say, because of what I heard. When it comes, every heart shall melt, and every hand shall fall helpless, and every spirit will grow faint, and every knee run with water. See, it is coming, it is here, oracle of the Lord God. So he was commissioned to go out and simply make that kind of statement. And you can imagine how that was received in terms of his dire prediction at that point. So at the very beginning of the book, where they try and say, how did he know that he was called to do this? And Ezekiel's call is that he's actually being sent to a nation of rebels. So this is the Lord speaking. They, as well as their fathers, have defied me to this very day. For the sons are brazen of face and stubborn of heart. I send you to them, and you shall say to them, thus says the Lord, whether they listen or not, for they are a rebellious breed, that they may know that there was a prophet among them. So what he's being steeled up for is that you're going to get rejected. You're going to say this, they're going to reject you, but you have to say it anyway. And Ezekiel is a human being, so he's probably, Jeremiah screamed out against God when he sent him on a tough mission, and he kept saying, God, why did you do this? Why did you set me up so that I end up being someone who's rejected, and everything I do really comes back upon me? And so he said, you duped me. That's Jeremiah. Maybe God, I don't know this, but maybe God learned from that mistake. When he got to Ezekiel, he mutes him. Okay, he's going to send him out, but the only time that he can actually say anything is when God opens his mouth to where he can say these words. So Ezekiel, the muted prophet, his tongue cleaves to his palate, and he's not to be a reprover of them unless God tells him what he's supposed to say. But I think what that indicates is that Ezekiel, in his very human sense, would have rebelled against this kind of catastrophe that was coming. And the reason the people are rebelling is they think, God, if you're just, how could you do this? It's too much. We've done some things wrong, but that kind of catastrophe just goes beyond limit. So Jeremiah dealt with that by actually protesting, which is a very central way that the Hebrew people, Old Testament, Book of Psalms, deals with problems that are overwhelming, is it lets you actually express the emotion that you're feeling and be honest about that to God. With Ezekiel here, he's not being allowed to lament. And it's somehow he's a rebel among the rebels, and that rebelliousness needs to be stopped. So he gets special divine intervention to stop him from doing that. So we get the chapter that I wanted to move more into is chapter 18 of Ezekiel. And it starts out with this proverb, which you've probably heard a number of times. The parents eat sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. And so clearly the issue here is that we didn't do anything. Some of our ancestors' parents did this, and we're reaping the ill effects of this. So clearly, I've labeled this slide a victim's mentality. So it's not fair, and so you just sort of, at this point, exonerate yourself or excuse yourself from any efforts to be an agent at that point. But it's going to be countered in a couple of verses later by the Lord. Behold, every person belongs to me. The life of the parents as well as the life of the children belong to me. The person who sins is the one who shall die. So for transgressions that are really sort of deserve a major punishment of death, then the individual is going to have to respond to this. Why that would be, that probably doesn't sound too revolutionary to us. But if you think of what would have been the default position for the Old Testament people, their default is collective responsibility. And this comes from the Ten Commandments, chapter 20 of Exodus. You shall not, and it has to do with prohibiting, you can't worship images, but if you shall not bow down before them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, inflicting punishment on their ancestors' wickedness, on the children of those who hate me, down to the third and the fourth generation, but showing love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. So if we're thinking that Ezekiel is saying only the individual, the one who sins, gets the punishment, there seems to be a contradiction here, but maybe the way you navigate between this is Ezekiel was talking about sins that merit capital punishment or death, that the individual is held accountable for. But I don't think he's going against the fact that, if when we live together and we slip or do something here or there and it has negative impacts, it actually is shared by the people that are around us. And it does. In some cases, that can get passed on from another generation to another generation, the whole family systems idea that we're acquainted with. So here, I think, in the Old Testament context, the way I typically try to explain this third and fourth generation is that's the households they lived in. They lived on what would be kind of like a family farm or whatever, and the houses actually had, so you'd have the parents and their children, and the grandparents would be there, so we got three generations in the same house, and it may be that there would be great-grandchildren in it, so it could go to 4 generations. So if a virus comes along and strikes someone, they share it. If an enemy comes in and invades and starts slaughtering and they come to your house, they don't pick out this one and that one. They do the whole. So when Israel tried to explain why bad things were happening to them, the way that they do it, especially from the time of the prophets, from about Isaiah on, so for 700 or so on, there's a radical kind of monotheism that things do not happen merely by chance. The Lord knows everything that's going to take place in nature and in history, and therefore if something happens that is like bad things are happening to good people, the default position is that actually maybe there's something hidden that you haven't paid attention to. So the counter to that, read the book of Job. You get Job doesn't agree with that. And actually at the end, these people that have this radical monotheism, that doctrine, they're his so-called friends who get condemned at the end of the book for not being sensitive to that. But the radical monotheism is basically, that would still be the default mode. And what Job is telling us is don't be so certain in every case. You have to pay attention to the... But my point here is to try and get to the collective responsibility. I think for us, we actually need more attention to that because our political, social system, probably from 1700s on, is basically we're looked upon as little atoms. And the reason we have social systems, we made contracts so that we don't kill one another off and that we can live together. But the basic position is that we are autonomous, free units that then construct the bonds that we make with those around us, which is really a radical departure from the earlier tradition which is a Catholic tradition, which is basically saying that we are born into an environment in which the bonds are there, and we need to nurture those, live within them. Parents shall not, and my point here is obviously in our time, collective responsibility is absolutely essential if indeed we're to have a constructive solution towards the climate change or global warming issue, however you want to define that. So there's, Ezekiel was saying that there's no intergenerational transfer of guilt. Parents shall not be put to death for their children, nor children be put to death for their parents, only for one's own crime. So that's in Deuteronomy. So he's not a lone wolf. It shows up before him on that point. Ezekiel then goes through what does a just person look like? And he has a profile, because what he's doing here is it's almost like when we do an examination of conscience in a penance service, or maybe we do this when we head to Eucharist that at the opening penitential rite. But that kind of process is going on here. The general statement in this chapter is the one who would be righteous does what is right and just. This person avoids idolatry, practices sexual restraint. He's getting this. I put the Leviticus passages because he's really, his profile here is coming from previous laws in the Pentateuch. He's attentive to social justice, does not practice oppression, returns a pledge given for a debt. Does that make any sense, what a pledge is for a debt? In Exodus 22, they actually, if you gave a loan to a poor person within the community and you wanted collateral, they wanted enough to be able to get something to eat so they could go out during the day and perhaps get a part-time job or something. If they came back and were not able to repay what you had given them, the collateral you took was the cloak that was on the person. And if you didn't give it back to them so that they could actually keep warm at night, that was considered a major transgression. And you find that actually, if you read Amos actually accuses his society, which was there was a real widening gap between the rich and the poor in the 700s. And he's accusing them that there are people that actually that insensitive, that they're taking the last little bit from the poor and crushing them in the process. So the person who's upright actually returns the pledge given for a debt, does not commit robbery, gives his food to the hungry. It's not just giving his excess, but actually the real upright person would actually be ready to give a portion of their own food to this person. So you have sort of our corporal works of mercy here that I think traditionally we've had. The other does not lend with interest or take accrued interest, which I think was even in our Catholic tradition up until probably just around the time of the Reformation, I believe. So that prohibition within Israel, you didn't do it to fellow Israelites. So you could take it from the other people who are outside your community. You could take interest from them. But as we all know, interest is a big item in our present financial system. It's okay. The last part on this is the general statement. He holds back his hand from wrongdoing, carries out true justice between one individual and another, and walks according to my statutes and keeps my stipulations by acting with integrity. And that righteous one shall surely live. Kind of declaration or pronouncement almost at the end of doing your repentance or examination of conscience. If you can go through all of these and pass that, then you're declared upright by the Lord. So what Ezekiel was doing in that chapter where they recited this proverb, parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. The ones that are saying it take the place of the children. That's who I am. And so they're saying I'm really a victim of circumstances. It's not anything I could have done anything about, but he's trying to get them back. That is not a good position to be in a place where you're not going to take agency. So his bottom line is he's saying you're guilty also. You may not be aware of it and not owning up to it, but you're a participant in this in some way. So he tries to establish a sense of agency in them. And this last one I threw in there I mentioned that Ezekiel had to be muted. There's one tiny little place in the whole book where he gets to lament. And this is in his vision in chapter 9, where he sees actually there's a divinely mandated genocide of Jerusalem. They're going to wipe out young and old. Everyone that's in their path is going to get killed off when Jerusalem falls, according to that vision. When Ezekiel sees this, I fell upon my face and cried out and said, Lord God, are you going to destroy all that remains of Israel when you pour out your wrath on Jerusalem? That's the only expression we get of protest from him in the whole book. Otherwise, and the reason for doing this is he's going to be a sort of model for the people that we have to go through this, and we can't be asking, is God doing this fairly or not? And we can't be saying that it's actually happening because the Babylonian gods are stronger than the Lord, that's why they're able to come in and do this, or that it's happening by chance. Actually, he's holding their feet to the fire, so what we'd probably call a highly moralistic way of understanding what's going on here. What I'm trying to point to, though, is I think the positive upside of that is that it is a way of actually getting people that feel victimized back on their feet again. Yeah, please.
Why is it that, I've attended a number of these sessions, but why is it, as you're pointing out on the screen with different readings, that the Lord God in this case is viewed as being so mean-spirited?
Yeah.
You know, because today, I'm pushing 76, others are younger, others are older. I don't see what the Lord God has to do with any of the things that I've come across in my life, whether they be good or bad. Because in retrospect, as a young man, he didn't put me in jail. It was some stupid thing that I did. My old man got me out. So it had nothing to do with the Lord being mean-spirited towards me.
Yeah.
That's where
Okay.
I really have
Yeah.
so many misgivings about any of the readings, because at church I was very active as a lecturer, and I tongue-in-cheek read
Yeah.
things, and I think to myself,
Yeah.
I can't see it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Good question. So I think the example you used about doing something wrong and getting thrown in jail, this model would say, actually, you recognize that you did something wrong, and therefore the social system around legal system actually reacted to that and brought about a sort of retribution for that. So in that sense, this picture is saying the divine is behind. It's not actually, it's under the fact that the law was created. Maybe the Lord had something to do with this, but it's more of a general sense that the order in life, that the Lord is watching over that, and if something goes out of sorts, that your life begins to fall apart or whatever, that it actually has to do with something that I've done that is then coming back. The Lord is calling me to account for that. this actually really stretches us, and your description of the divine image here is right on, in the sense that it seems so mean-spirited, that doesn't seem to be the God that probably we've been raised with, etc. What the Old Testament was doing is they're thinking that God, or they're believing that God is in charge of everything. So why are these nations coming in and taking over us? Why are all of these bad things happening to good people in the process? If you take the prophets, they're saying that that's not just something where you step back and say, well, it just happened by chance. And I pointed out that Job would have trouble with this. The response that they actually propose, what does Job do when they accuse him of that? And say that actually you must have done some hidden sin that resulted in the loss of your family and all of your property. And what you're seeing there is that the whole book of Job shows someone that's actually protesting. So their way of dealing with why bad things happen to good people is actually you need to protest. So this puts Job and Jeremiah, their response is probably the more normal response for the Israelite people. So when you pick up the lament psalms in the Old Testament, something terrible has happened that you think is really not fair, it's not right, that God may be mean-spirited in this, what you do is you actually take it back to God and you say, why did you let this happen? Why did you let these enemies come in? Or you get to the point is, why are you doing this to me? Why are you taking my health away? So their response is that they don't have an intellectual solution. Nobody does. What their response is they take it into a dialogue in which you're treating the source of all that exists as a person, as personal. So that's foundational in this, and you're taking it back to that God and you're protesting to this and expecting you can do something about this and do something as a result. So actually, every time I teach undergrads the Old Testament, we do pretty well when we go through Genesis, Exodus, and get up to and some of the nice. You get into the prophets, and all of a sudden this thing starts to weigh down, and it's relentless in terms of one disaster after another because it's crisis literature. This is when bad things have happened to the community. And why has this happened? Is it because God just fell asleep and is not watching over us anymore? But they actually take the more radical monotheistic position that no, God is there and there's something in between. And if it's not hidden sins on our part, they'd often talk about it coming from previous generations. We're getting the offshoot of that. But somehow collectively, if not individually, we're responsible. The point with Ezekiel is that the people really doubted whether that collective responsibility should be. Does that justify the major catastrophe that came when they were destroyed as a nation? And he's coming back and saying, don't just blame it on your ancestors, that you're involved in this also. That is part of it. And so whether this is persuasive or not, I think the positive thing that I see here is that he's actually addressing what I would call this victim mentality, that we've been crushed by this, but if you're down, what's going to get you back up on your feet? Some of my colleagues who work in this area also have gotten into what they call trauma theory. And Kathleen O'Connor, who taught for years down in Georgia at a seminary there, was making the point that she was surprised that she'd teach this group of seminarians, theology students that would come in, and they go through all of these horrible punishments and whatever that you get in those passages where, and they're saying that God is doing this. And it seemed, she began to notice that some of these students actually perked up as they went through this. And it happened that they had suffered some kind of abuse in their life, and that somehow being able to at least say that I was part of the family, there was a measure of collective responsibility, even though that's complicated. But nevertheless, taking a step towards I can do something. They got a sense of agency and moved back. She was puzzled, saying, how can they read this prophetic poetry and this happens? And so she kept exploring that. So there's a lot of literature on that out at this point, which confirms in my mind the sense that what he's up to here is if we accept a measure of responsibility, it actually will enable us to do something rather than being overwhelmed, which I think moves us into a more constructive of set. So, but I like your question because I think most Christians from the earliest time, one of the tendencies was to take the Old Testament, throw it out the window, and we're in the New Testament. And there's a fellow called Marcion who did this in the early centuries. And he not only threw out the Old Testament, but he took only the Gospel of Luke in a truncated form, and he took only a few of the epistles of Paul, because that told him that the God that he was worshiping was the God of love and not the God of wrath of the Old Testament. So he threw it. This guy was condemned. Every one of the early church writers fought against this, which I think points, and why this is so important is the Old Testament is very down to earth. Religion is not simply something that you interiorize. It's me and God, or it's something. Religion has to, your faith in God has to have a public dimension to it. The fact that God is with us, it has to be borne out in the data, in the facts. So Ezekiel here is saying that, Jerusalem fell, and it looks like the Babylonian gods are more powerful. Therefore, if you take the facts of visible history, it seems like the story's over. Well, our ancestors believed they got on the wrong bus and they ended up somewhere, and here we are. But actually what he's saying is you need to think bigger about this, and you need to think longer term about who this God is. So the whole issue of God creating the world actually came to focus. It's not that they didn't have that idea earlier, but it really gets pronounced in this time after the destruction of Jerusalem, because they're trying to say our God is not just the most powerful of all the gods who watches over us, but actually this God created everything and is fully in charge of both nature and history. So it's the sense of trying to stay with this God in a time of crisis, that cynicism from that little proverb that I showed earlier, the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge, he goes right after that, because it's not going to help to get themselves back on their feet in this situation. So, yeah.
Common trauma that all of us have is the loss of a loved one. And some of the different steps of grieving is anger.
Right.
And God, why did you take this person? So,
Right.
not that we have to be in a war zone to know trauma.
Right.
But common experiences.
Right. Yeah, good point. So, from that angle, you would, I think what's more prominent within the Old Testament writings, so you take the lament psalms and you take someone like Jeremiah, or you take Job, is they're acknowledging the legitimacy of that kind of anguish and So it's sort of, you're sharing in the death of the loved one, in a sense. And so what Kubler-Ross goes through, those 5 stages, what is it, denial, whatever. Bargaining, okay. But anyway, but those stages make sense, and I think actually the Old Testament Psalms, the lament Psalms, really encourage that kind of expression of anger towards God. When a loved one has been taken away, oftentimes the other spouse will come back and say, why did God allow this to happen? Why did this person have to suffer so much in this? And that kind of expression, I think, is really constructive, very important. So from that angle, Ezekiel's situation is really an exception, which tells me that he's in a unique situation in which his audience is tending to feel victimized, and the expression of that is actually going to be blaming and not moving on from it. So he's kind of a goad to push them back in that sense. So he's mean-spirited. He's a hard guy. But okay. But the positive, probably the best upshot out of this is repentance, which shows up at the end of the chapter. But the wicked one who repents of all the sins he has committed, keeps all my statutes and does what is right and just, he shall surely live, he shall not die. So notice repentance. If he does this, so you could live horrible life and repent at the last minute, and from Ezekiel's standpoint, you're in the sense that you're back with God at that juncture. By contrast, so all the transgressions he shall live because of the righteous deeds he has done. And you get the sense here, this is one of the only places in the book of Ezekiel that you get an emotion from his God. His God is really cold. But here he says, do I take delight in the death of the wicked one? Which is saying, no, I don't. I really want everyone to turn back and to find life. That's the first window we get into sort of a compassionate sense of this God. So basically the image he has of God is probably one of the harshest in the Old Testament until you get to the very latter parts of the book. But the positive thing here about repentance is this you can clear out the slate by an authentic relationship right now with God. By contrast, backsliding is deadly. So you can live a good, upright life. You can store up your treasure of merits in heaven so that when you get there, you expect God's got to let me in. But what happened is 2 days before you got there, you slipped. What happens is your whole treasury gets eliminated. It's gone.
Seems so unfair, doesn't it?
It does. But if you take what seems very unfair here and you turn it the other way, what's he after? What do you think he's after in that kind of, what's most important? Pardon? Yeah, the relationship, it's got to be alive. It's a relationship right now. So if the kind of things he's talking about are not slips that, are minor, whatever. It would be a rejection of God, saying, God, you're just not, I don't believe in you, etc. That would be the one that would break the relationship, that would eliminate all the good deeds that you've done in the past. But I think to see the importance of the aliveness and the presentness of the relationship is what he's emphasizing here, which actually creates newness. And you can be in a horrible situation, but if you make that turn, you actually are right into God's good graces at that point. So that the message is to make sure that relationship is alive. and stay with it at that point. And you can't rely on what I've done and bring my record, so you've got to hold on God. God, you've got to let me in. You know what I've done? It's not, and that's pretty standard Catholic Christian teaching coming out of the New Testament, that you're justified by your faith and not by your works. That may sound Lutheran, but it's also Catholic. So, okay. So, they, as many of you were reacting, this just does not seem fair, the way, and they reacted the same way. And he pushes it right back at them. That's the way prophets are not they don't give you a lot of reasons when they simply state a position and you take it or leave it. So, therefore, I will judge each of you according to your ways, house of Israel, oracle of the Lord. Repent and turn back from all your transgressions so that it does not become an iniquitous stumbling block for you. Cast behind you all your transgressions and make for yourselves a new heart and a new spirit. It's interesting in this chapter, make for yourself a new heart and a new spirit. When you get to chapter 36 of the book of Ezekiel, it's that wonderful chapter that we have in the Easter Vigil, from Ezekiel, and he talks about God is going to give each of us a new heart and a new spirit, which is the way that we move forward. So here's where Ezekiel is kind of 180 degrees. Now he's more friendly, and the understanding, because what God does is it's an abundance of God's intervention in our lives, which actually takes the heart, which is our control center. What governs us is not up here. It's what brings together all of us in this. The heart is the center. It's not the pumping mechanism of blood, but it's the center of our willing and feeling and thinking, where all of these are integrated within us. So we're very much embodied human beings. We're not just thinking heads that happen to be placed in a body, but actually who we are is very much embedded, and we are a unit in this. So what Ezekiel is saying as the hopeful thing that comes out of is that God actually is going to intervene, and he's going to change our hearts. He's going to use a heart transplant. But not only that, and Christians think this seems pretty standard because Paul got this, I think, from Ezekiel in some ways. But God is going to give us a share of the divine spirit so that we actually become part of God's life at that point. They don't go as far. Paul takes us in. We're adopted in as children, and we become part of God's family at that point. But I think Ezekiel's salvation oracle in 36 actually does that. The point here is that, is there a question? Yeah, please, Roger. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Which, as you're pointing to it, it's a complex topic, and to give a nice, clean definition probably will not. You need to stay with it and unfold it at that point to understand.
I just thought of it in the context here.
Yeah.
Terms, but you kind of have to remember sometimes not all people define things the same way.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. So this final section here, we need to take a break here pretty quick. I think is that what we're doing, or do we go to 10:30? Okay, we've got another half hour. But here at the end of this section on Ezekiel, these are my words, but God is faithful and will not turn away from the covenant because God has staked his reputation on this. So in effect, what I'm saying here is that God entered into covenant with our ancestors and the Israelite people, and God's whole public reputation rests on whether it goes well for his people or not. So if his people they lose their land and their way of life, etc., the neighbors look at this and they say, your God is a weakling, can't do anything, can't support it. And this is a serious problem for this prophet. So he's arguing that this God has a lot at stake in whether your fortunes come back, because he entered into a covenant in which he binds up his life with all of us. So in effect, the covenant is really radical here. You find other places in the Old Testament with Moses, if you do such and such, and if you break fidelity, God is going to cast you off and throw you away. Ezekiel is arguing that when you sin like this, he's not going to throw away the Israelite community or the people, because he can do a little sorting, so individually we might but collectively he's not going to get rid of the community of faith. He's going to stay with that to the bitter end, which is why I think he comes up with that salvation oracle in which he says, God has watched us and we can't remain faithful. We as a people, seem to stumble. So God actually ups the amount of help or the intervention and gives us a brand new heart so that we get back on our feet. And for him, that would have meant going back into the land and beginning to prosper. So when you get to the end of his book, the people are... But the key thing here is that God entered into a covenant that is unbreakable. And you are my people, and I will be your God. And there's nothing that can eliminate that for this prophet. So in a sense, what I'm trying to point out here, this guy is off on the edge in terms of being extreme with his image of a radical, sort of mean God. But his understanding of God is actually growing out of their collective experience. Things were awful for them. Things confusing, really unbelievable. How do you make sense out of this? So rather than just throw up their hands, he's looking into the tradition and saying, behind this, at some point, God is watching over all of this and is in charge. And so the question for us is to try and get back into right relationship with this God at that point. So the whole of his book, I think, ends up being hopeful. School of Theology gave an Ezekiel Prophet of Hope award to one of our alums, Monsignor Dillenberger, and he says, I read through this book so many times, I can't find the hope in this. I don't see where it's at, And then he read it again, I think, at the end, and he began to see where it was actually coming from. So it's really, really dark, catastrophic times in which he's pointing a way forward in this. And but the key thing is the way forward is we somehow have to participate in how we move forward with this. So to jump then, I've done enough Ezekiel. You're inundated with that. But the climate crisis, on a book from Jeffrey Sachs, who's an economist out of Columbia, who's been an advisor to the United Nations General Ki Ban Moon, I think. I get his name wrong, but it's that fellow. But he's the primary advisor to him on issues of sustainability. And so he's listed off, and the book is actually, they're selling a couple of copies out here on the table. But global economic problem so the greenhouse gas, GHG, the emissions are in proportion to income levels. So obviously, us in the developed world are producing more of these and getting them off into the atmosphere than the poorer countries. The challenge, second item, a challenge to mobilize the world. So you have this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Rio Summit in 1992 had 195 signatories of countries that, so they're trying, have been trying. It's an intergenerational problem, how to take seriously the impact on future generations. Because obviously what they're saying, this thing won't hit probably in most of our lifetimes with real intensity, but if you have grandchildren, they're going to get a lot of the negative impacts of this pretty strongly. The core of the modern economy, its energy source, is a major generator of greenhouse gas. So you know what we're up against. It's not just fighting the coal and gas and oil companies, but we're also we're intertwined with that. If you have retirement funds or whatever, if that whole thing got, okay, we're just going to stop using that, and so all the coal in the ground cannot be used, the amount on that's there on their balance sheet, or the wealth that's associated with that, would ripple all the way through the economy in that sense. So a major issue which is calling for some kind of, if we're going to get somewhere, there has to be some steps gradually to try and change what is the source that generates our electricity in this process. So climate change is a slow-moving crisis. Beautiful day out. You're talking about climate, it's warmer, it's nice, it's beautiful. What Sachs did is it's like the proverbial frog in the water. And so if you heat it up slowly, the frog stays there. But when it starts to boil, it's too late, it can't get out. And it gets cooked in the process. So the solutions to climate change are inherently complex, and the energy sector is home to the world's most powerful companies. So these are the ones he lists out as some of the real big challenges, key issues. So I'm going to try see if I can catch this. It's another video. There we go.
The land, to me, it's very
Can you
unique.
maximize
I just
that?
love southeastern Montana. This is my home, and my love for this place is so deep because it's who I am.
Maybe you can't see it, but this land is an island in a sea of coal development. It's the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation, located in a region that produces 40% of U.S. coal, sending it from coast to coast.
It's a place no one really thinks about, but that everyone is impacted by. If you're paying attention to energy and climate change, you need to be paying attention to the Powder River Basin. Billions and billions of tons of coal lie under the ground here. And what happens here will determine how the United States does on its climate policy.
Researchers say we have to leave most fossil fuels in the ground if we're going to limit climate change to 2 degrees Celsius. That's when droughts get supercharged and some low-lying countries may actually disappear. The scale of change that's needed is staggering. For natural gas and oil, sure, but especially for coal. In the United States, 95% of coal must be left unburned. It's a message many indigenous people here have taken to heart.
Our land is an extension of our home. We have to protect it for our children and grandchildren and future generations that are yet to come.
But taking a stand against fossil fuels has come with a price for the Northern Cheyenne. And some tribal members want to see their resources extracted for profit.
We have 80% unemployment. And every day I see the poverty, the desperation. I believe coal will give people work. And I don't see anything else happening.
It's funny because the industry always says coal provides cheap energy. Go to the reservation and you see that people are spending $600 to $700 a month on their bills in the winter. That's not cheap. So as we're saying no to these new coal mines, we need to be moving forward with the renewables and making sure people know that there's alternatives.
This is the room we stay in. There's 4 of us in here. We put blankets on the windows. We just all cover up because it gets pretty chilly in here at nights.
In spite of that, you were telling me that you're not in favor of developing coal here. There's some people who say that would create jobs.
Yeah, a lot of people say that, but it's beautiful out here and I don't want to see it ruined. To me, I think that's more important than all the money. So in the future-wise, my kids would have a place to call home.
Our tribe is really struggling. Yes, we need jobs. Yes, we need a sustainable economy, but not at the price of our homelands. There's a better way. And it's going to take some education. It's going to take some work. But in the long run, it's going to be better.
Vanessa Braided Hair is trying to lead a revolution away from coal and towards cleaner energy. The Northern Cheyennes shouldn't have to fight this on their own. And they shouldn't have to choose between jobs and clean energy. They need our support. They need world leaders to send clear signals that coal is dangerous and costly, and that we're investing in a cleaner future.
I love it here. My ancestors loved it too. And so that deep love that they have, I carry it too. And I think that's worth fighting for.
Okay. So, when that story came out, it was just out last week. It was on the CNN webpage, and it struck me, and some of the accompanying news story with it was pointing out how, with the Paris climate talks that had started on Monday, that are extending for the next couple of weeks, that this actually could serve as kind of a symbol for the world in the sense of how a people that's really impoverished like this, but it's their love of the land that's keeping them living in that way. How they do this collectively is really a question. How, as a tribal people, but must be their connection, as she was saying, to the ancestors, etc. In the land itself. So, not being a scientist, I'm sure there are a number of you that are more knowledgeable on this than I am. So if I stumble, please pipe up and make the corrections in this. But I've taken a lot of this data. There's a book out there by Jeffrey Sachs, who I referenced earlier. A lot of this came from his account of this, so I'm trusting in him. But the sun's radiation reaches the earth as ultraviolet radiation. We know that. You get sunburn from it, etc. Much of this radiation passes through the atmosphere and arrives on the planet. But as we know, when we have snow cover and ice, etc., it reflects back pretty strongly. A lot of that will go right back out, or at least some of it will be. And then some on the surface, that's not reflected back gets absorbed and warms the earth. So the greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, I think like cattle lots have a lot of methane that come from them. Nitrous oxide, I think farmers that go out and spread, they put nitrogen on their soil, I think is nitrous oxide in that. And then all these hydrofluorocarbons, etc., and other ones that are artificially made, which they've gotten those a bit more under control. So it's the first three that are really the issue, especially the first one. But also water vapor can also trap infrared. So what would it be like if we didn't have the greenhouse gas effect? Without it, the Earth would be around 6.8 degrees. With the greenhouse effect, it's around 64. So do you want that or do you want that? So it's greenhouse gas effect is not all bad. So it clearly, but our food crops and farm systems, the locations of plants and animals, locations of cities, key infrastructure, all of our roads and bridges, ports and buildings, and public health shaped it's been shaped by a fairly stable temperature range during the past 10,000 years, which he calls the Holocene period. The one before that, Pleistocene, was characterized by periodic ice ages. But so the effect of it warms the temperature. The Earth warms to a temperature at which it radiates energy to space at the same rate that the sun transmits it to Earth. So there's a balance here. You get incoming ultraviolet, then an equivalent amount of infrared has to go back out. And if that's not in balance, then you have to get more ultraviolet coming into the Earth, which gets absorbed there. So it calls this black body radiation. So any warm body radiates a kind of electromagnetic energy. The warmer the body, the greater the radiation. So when the sun radiates its ultraviolet to the Earth's surface, the Earth radiates these infrared radiation back to space. In energy balance, the incoming ultraviolet must equal the outgoing infrared. The Earth's atmosphere, though, it actually traps. It contains special molecules like carbon dioxide or methane, those that I named. They trap part of the infrared that's going back up. After we've gotten the ultraviolet, then this infrared that's going back up. If you've got too much carbon dioxide up there, it's going to capture a lot of that. But as we noted earlier, it needs to balance out. You've got to have enough infrared actually going back into space that it balances what's coming in. So the greenhouse gases, the more you have there that trap it, the infrared radiation, change in the energy balance. So more ultraviolet hits the Earth rather than infrared. So the greenhouse gases do not absorb the incoming ultraviolet, only the outgoing infrared. So how much does the Earth warm? Just enough so that at the higher temperature the Earth radiates extra infrared radiation by just enough that even after some of it is trapped by the greenhouse gases, the remainder that leaves the Earth and goes into space just balances the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. So if we know how much is trapped, the CO2 traps the infrared, if we know how much it's doing that, then we know how much the Earth must rise in temperature in order to get this balance back in the energy. Okay, does that make some sense? A little bit of sense? Okay. All right, so the question here is CO2 stays in the atmosphere a long, long time because when it rains, it doesn't wash back. Methane is 23 times more, it contains, that doesn't make sense. It contains 23 times more heat than CO2, but it stays in the atmosphere, so it'll trap 23 times more, but it only stays in the atmosphere for 10 years rather than hundreds of years. So CO2 accounts for 77% of the greenhouse effect. The top three are that carbon dioxide, methane, and that nitrous oxide, which is about 99% of the total. So the world is emitting about 35 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, which comes from burning coal, oil, and gas. And another 3.5 billion tons comes from cutting down trees, clearing land for farms and pasture lands, especially if you go like the Amazon, Congo River basin. So a lot of that is happening there.
Is that cutting the trees down from burning them?
I think part of it is probably part of it is burning, but also underneath, that would probably be where the carbon dioxide comes from. But apparently, if you go into the Amazon basin, there's a lot of methane that's actually in the bogs that's under that. So that's another issue there. But so and also the other issue is you have trees. Don't trees capture carbon dioxide? Yeah.
Called sequestration.
Okay?
And the more vegetation that you have, the greater the sequestration, and that's where you're referring to a balance.
Yeah.
You know, the warming climate now is as a result of climate change and the warming that we are having. The Arctic area up north, where it's sequestrated in that frigid ground because it's warming, there it's releasing the methane.
Sure.
But anyone that has woods or forest on their property, really, I think they're beginning to consider that, is to leave that land there wooded because it's a form of sequestration and it's actually absorbing the CO2 before they're burned.
Right.
Because of the green.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sequestration is another word for storing.
Storing. Okay. 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 Good.
What about
Good.
prairies? The grasses in the prairies, don't they help also?
Someone know about that? In terms of grasses and prairies, would they actually?
Certainly do.
Okay.
I thought so.
Okay.
They're trying to do that now with the farmers by putting between the corn rolls and the soybeans, rather than just clear, ground.
Okay.
They're actually planting other rye between the corn to see how that will work.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Black soil, heavy rich black soil is essentially organic matter. That's sequestered carbon. If you leave it bare, with the sun burning down on it, you're essentially producing carbon dioxide.
It is producing carbon dioxide when it's. Okay.
The sun is literally burning that off. The low temperature combustion, if you want to call it that.
Okay.
But the real issue, I think you pointed out earlier, is all this carbon that's sequestered in coal, oil, natural gas. We're releasing it on an unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
Which is the name of the book that I just gave you. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
we talked about that.
Yeah.
In terms of it's an unprecedented scale.
Right. Yeah. Great. Okay. So the concentration of carbon dioxide on the planet, we haven't seen this for 3 million years, according to Sachs on this. So, but the first part, the way they measure it is how many molecules of carbon dioxide for every million molecules in the air. This amount in 2013 soared from 320, from 1958 to 2013, went from 320 to 400. I don't understand all these numbers, but that's pretty dramatic, I guess, in terms of, yeah. Okay, so where's it coming from? And they call it human activity or anthropogenic. It's what humans are doing rather than nature on its own is pushing the planet into a climate zone completely unknown in human history, or the Earth's recent history. So there are things that would make the amount of carbon dioxide fluctuate in cycles. Some of it would be volcanoes. Others, he calls it the flux between carbon dioxide between the ocean and the atmosphere, changes in the Earth's orbital cycle. But all of those things would take place over a longer span of time. And so you wouldn't have as many dramatic, the change is not as dramatic as it's happening at this point So the dire predictions that they give are, by the end of the century, if we just stay the course where we're at right now, the atmosphere will rise 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. With a 4-degree rise, there's a 50% drop in crop yields in Africa. Glaciers will disappear. Soil moisture will be lost, and rainfall will decline in many regions. And then there will be massive heat waves, droughts, floods, extreme tropical cyclones. Apparently what the current Paris conference is trying to do is get the nations to agree to keep it below a 2 degrees Celsius. Which apparently is a real stretch given where we've been and where we're headed. But at least at 5...
Developed countries don't want to do it,
Well,
according to some of the reports.
well, and yeah, when you think about it, it really demands a dramatic change in lifestyle, is what it does. So you're going to get a lot of resistance just in terms of our economy. It's difficult, but at 5 degrees or more, the sea level rises, goes after cities like London, New York, Shanghai, etc. The northeast coast, apparently that superstorm Sandy was precipitated by the fact the rise in the sea level there was by a foot or a third of a meter, and that triggered that kind of disaster, storm surges, soil erosion, etc. So by the end of the century, sea levels, if it's at 5 degrees, could be a meter higher or perhaps several meters higher, and the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica would be gone. But also a drop in soil moisture. The Sahel, which is actually that region in Africa between the Sahara and then moving into something that would be more agricultural or at least grazing land. So that little shaded area is what's referred to as Sahel. Kind of looks like this. There it's probably headed more towards the Sahara in contrast to this. But obviously if you have lower rain, this part is going to be more dominant than this. And what does it do to the people that are dependent upon that kind of land? That drop in soil moisture would occur there, also in the U.S. Southwest, the Mediterranean basin. Higher food prices combined with politics, according to Sachs, has already created a tremendous amount of unrest in North Africa and Syria, Palestine. So we've heard about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for decades. But one of the things we probably don't pay attention to is why did Israel push up to get the Golan Heights back in the '67 war? The headwaters of the Jordan River are actually up there. And by pushing that, they got a hold on the headwaters of the Jordan River, which actually supplies the water that they use for a lot of irrigation down in the southern part of the country in the Negev for the last 20 or so years. So water rights, fighting over water, it's been occurring there, and this is only going to ramp up in terms of this trend. So with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the oceans will become more acidic, which will lead to dying off of major classes of animal life, like shellfish, animals with exoskeletons like lobsters and crabs, and microscopic plankton. Coral reefs will be in danger with that. So this is a nice little crane shot over the Sag. Now that makes it look like this is the way it's supposed to be, kind of peaceful. But so possible responses, what can we do? Well, mitigation. So to reduce greenhouse gases by limiting the increase in average annual temperature to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, above the pre-industrial level, which I think he's taking that back into probably the 19th century is where he's taking that to. So it's a reducing of burning of fossil fuels, a change of land use by heading off deforestation, and a reduction in the emission of methane and nitrous oxide. What would we do if we reduce nitrous oxide? What would be a practical step that would, or maybe it's impractical, but what would be a place, where does it come from? Yeah.
I believe it's emissions coal-fired power plants.
Is it? How about what they do in terms of farming? When you put nitrogen on there? But Is that what that's, it's called nitrogen though, right?
Like the anhydrous ammonia, which is another issue. And nitrous oxide is essentially
Okay,
greenhouse
okay,
gas. That's from coal-burning power plants.
okay. Okay, so,
In coal, micro
okay, so two of these at least. Is there methane that comes out of coal burning, or is that that's different?
The biggest source of methane, I believe, I haven't done a lot of research on the internet, but the biggest source is from hydraulic fracking.
Okay,
Fracking,
for natural gas, huh?
fracking with oil, a lot of the methane will escape.
Okay, okay,
DVD on that called Frackland, which is really scary because I found it on
yeah.
the C.C. Heisen guy talking about that was in the DVD.
Okay, okay, great, thank you. So, pardon? Okay, do we have a microphone over there? Because I can't repeat all of what he said here.
Lots of better than I had several kids of my own. Like, I can speak real loud and kind of stand up. The issue, the question I believe was, what is
Nitrous oxide, yeah.
nitrous oxide? That comes from coal-burning power plants. You had said it came from farmland. Our farming practices, we use anhydrous ammonia, which is not a greenhouse gas. Anhydrous ammonia is essentially used as a fertilizer. What it does to our farming soil is another issue. It's not to do with climate change. But the other one, you said, where does the methane come from that's coming in the atmosphere?
Right.
You get these articles about, cattle belch methane and so on, and so it's a big problem. The huge amount, and I haven't gone on to a website to quantify this, but a huge amount of methane is released in the fracking process, either when you're drilling and trying to tap natural gas or oil. Fracking is the, not to mention all the bad things that you get in the groundwater and in the surface water, but what it does is it releases a lot of methane, natural gas, to the atmosphere, and it's a very potent greenhouse gas.
Okay,
So, and that's where that
Yeah.
a lot of that comes from.
okay, okay, great, thank you. All right, so mitigation, trying to keep those three major forms of greenhouse gas and limit those. Adaptation would be another response. Just prepare to live more safely and effectively with the consequences of climate change. So you know that there are going to be storm surges in your city, so you make some barriers or whatever. You protect your crops from high temperatures and droughts, and I think the crops we have now can actually survive a lot of dry weather, much more so than maybe 10 years ago, or the modification in the seeds that are there. Redesign agricultural technologies to promote more drought resistance, heat tolerance, and flood tolerance in our crops. So you can do some of those things, but the point is that they're not enough. It's still, so the question then would be to decarbonize. How can we do this? Well, one thing would be energy efficiency, greater output per unit of energy input, and apparently California has laws that have actually pushed development on that to where each unit has to meet certain standards that it's more energy efficient. The other is to reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide per megawatt hours of electricity. And thirdly, a fuel shift. Go to clean energy rather than fossil fuels, solar, wind, geothermal in the process. So what are our prospects? If we could stop all new net emission entirely and maintain the atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as they are in 2014, this would not be enough to stop global warming. The Earth's temperature, as he says, Sachs, has increased by 0.9 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial temperature, but the oceans have not caught up with this yet, with what the land has warmed to. When they do, then there's another 0.6 degree higher. So actually, where we stand right now is 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've got a half degree before we get to what they regard as catastrophic, kind of. So warming is in store. There will be the delay in the ocean, the inevitability that there are going to be a buildup of greenhouse gases in the short term. So there needs to be much diligence and global cooperation to keep from rising above 2 degrees. Even though we're also going to, even if it stays there, we're going to have changes. There are going to be more droughts and floods, heat waves, and extreme storms. So how could obviously, you know, we can do things individually, we can consume less, we can conserve or whatever, but that still will not ward off and keep this thing below 2 degrees. There has to be something that's collectively done, and that's why he came through with policy instruments. One thing that they would do is a carbon tax, which means that if you are actually running a coal-fired plant, that the cost of that emission to the environment, the environmental, social cost of that, you get taxed for that, which then would push on those industries to actually switch how they're doing this. As you can imagine, this has tremendous pushback. It would be very costly. The other is a permit system. Emitters of carbon dioxide must buy a permit to do so. The other one is feed-in tariffs, so the government pays a utility an extra price if energy is from a green source or low carbon source. So those are 3 ideas that at least are out there, and some have been implemented in some countries. So that's kind of what I have on the sort of science of this, to see why this is an issue and what are the prospects, where we're headed. So now I'm sort of moving back towards a more theological approach to this thing. And I'm drawing upon an Old Testament theologian, Sally McFaig, who's written quite a bit on this, plus just environmental, ecological concerns. She's saying the well-being of all creation and not just of some human beings who are saved for life in another world is what salvation is about. So we may talk about salvation as what's after life and getting out, etc., but that's not really in accord with our whole tradition. It's an element, but the element, why did Christ come here and become incarnate? Because God wanted to show the solidarity with all of us, but not just all of us, but in a sense with the whole of creation. So if 20% of human beings possess 80% of the world's resources, then radical changes need to occur in the lifestyle of some parts of the whole. So she's arguing here, Christians must live a life of limitation, of enoughness, and even go so far as to say even sacrifice. Discipleship for well-off contemporary Christians means living, following the cross, cruciform living, which what it's after is you're living in solidarity with those who are oppressed and suffering. In this, we must learn from the way that nature operates. There's a single principle behind all existing order in nature. This comes from Marcelo Gleiser, talking about emergent realities in the cosmos. So if you watch nature, everything tries to exist, and there's an all-embracing urge to exist and to bind what manifests itself at all levels. If you go from subatomic particles all the way up to the observable part of nature. Everything is this urge to try and exist. But But the second one is I find really interesting. The law of physics dictate that inanimate systems never use more energy than they have to, and they never choose a more costly path to achieve the same end result. So we must look beyond our own, he counsels, we have to look beyond our own immediate needs and greed and reintegrate ourselves into a physical reality that transcends political and social boundaries. So somehow nature, which operates as we typically talk about according to laws, if we take a lesson from them, is they're not going to use up more energy than they really need, which is a challenge to us. So Pope Francis picks up on this idea. The ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us, which the way our modern culture, probably even before that, but our culture is defined as anthropocentric, like humans are at the middle, at the center of everything. And you can go back and find scriptural passages. One of my favorite psalms for illustrating this is Psalm 8, which starts out, at the very middle of that psalm is, why, God, have you made human beings? What are we that you've made us a little less than the angels or of gods, and you put everything under our feet? And it goes through a whole catalog of the various categories of creatures. All of these are put under humans' feet. So if you looked at that, it would be saying, well, it looks like the psalm is saying God has given us charge, that we are to dominate nature. The key thing that's important in that psalm is it starts out, the very first line and the very end line, how great are your works, so how wonderful you are. It's praising God, and that is actually the key point in whether we can actually be stewards of creation in a responsible way. Because if we're centered in human beings, we're probably going to exploit what's there. Whereas if we're actually in harmony and in communion with God, at this point what feeds us and keeps us alive is not what we simply do with what's at our command, but we're receiving from the divine and being in relationship with the divine. As we go along here, one of Pope Francis' key things is that if human beings do not have this divine relationship, what we do in terms of that, the hungers that we have as creatures, those spiritual hungers, we will probably tend to try to satisfy those with material things. So we make material things try to serve what is basically a spiritual challenge. And therefore we overuse them and misuse them in the process. So the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not in us, but rather all creatures are moving forward with us and through us toward a common point of arrival, which is God, in that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illumines all things. Some of you are familiar with Teilhard de Chardin. I think he's footnoted in this particular, where it's your cosmogenesis, your Christogenesis, you're moving towards Christ. The whole cosmos is in that process. When our hearts are authentically open to universal communion, this sense of fraternity excludes nothing and no one. So the issue here is, it's not only that we need to be attentive to the poor in developing countries or the poor in our midst, we also need to be attentive to these species. I started out with a few shots of our woods out here next to Stella Maris and the ecological environment that's there. What we hear is that what's happening is the diversity of species is really, there are species being wiped out simply by the the unfriendly environment now that they're in. Human beings can survive this to this point, but the catastrophe we're pointing towards, there's a certain point in this increase of carbon dioxide and climate change that nature will still be here, but culture will be impossible. Human beings won't be able to exist on the planet if it gets to a certain point. So nature will still be there, but it'll be in a different form at that point. So Pope Francis talks then in the final one, we cannot claim to have a sound ethics, a culture, and a spirituality genuinely capable of setting limits and teaching clear-minded self-restraint. That's not, he's arguing that's not where we're at. That self-restraint and an ethics that can actually bring about this restraint is something that we're way behind on. So jumping back to McFague, she talks about the neoclassical model of economics, which probably Adam Smith back in, is that 1700s, 1800s, that Adam Smith is. So in this model, and I see a lot of the guy that wrote Thomas Hobbes in this also. We are basically selfish individuals who are acting out of self-interest, and will eventually this will create some benefits for all in the system. So if we're looked upon as these little atoms that we're sort of programmed to promote our own self-interest, what this system is saying is, well, we want to promote that kind of competition. So if I'm going to be successful in life, I get in there and I prepare myself, I do all my work, and I try to build up something. Probably I get a business in order, or I amass wealth or whatever, and that kind of accumulation is going to be my sign of success. And maybe, in the process of doing that, I may have started up a business or work or whatever that actually is benefit to the society at large in some way. So that model is saying that progress is fueled by this kind of self-centered competition. But the alternative ecological economic model has the fundamental point that we are basically interrelated and interdependent creatures who need one another to survive and flourish, which is really a tall order. Yeah.
I'm thinking of in the 1950s, 60s, when the small farmers were forced off the land. That really was bigger than better. It's not necessarily better.
I would agree. Yes, the question was, the point, during the 1980s when you had the farm crisis and there was really the elimination of a lot of family farms, one of my uncles who's in farming, who actually went bigger and is still in it, and he would talk about it and say simply, it's just not efficient. You got to do the bigger one. You got the machine that's going to run this better. So it was, it was the economics of it that drove it. And the technology. So the technology is the other question. Yeah?
I have a question. This is the second time that humanity's been threatened. For the nuclear power was finally succumb when we discovered that we admitted that it was mutually assured destruction. Now, in this case, have we gotten to that point, or are the people who are producing getting really super rich, the 1% or the 1%, do they think they still think they can survive this because they're not living on the coast and they're not in Africa, and that this is actually a pretty healthy phase so we can get rid of the excess population? Now, are we to the stage where the people actually making the decisions, given that there's not that much democracy around yet, or those people making decisions, are they still cheering this process on because they personally believe they can survive? Or
good question. It's
I don't know
what
the
are
answer, of course.
what are the motivations at that point? For and I think we could all think if if I had this power, this massive fortune, I probably would be reluctant to let go of this in the process. So the issue here is to try and point out the consequences of this. And your point, do they think they can survive this? Well, probably you just don't look at it.
Yeah, where are we in that? Between, do we think we can survive because we're not on the coast?
Well, that's a good question. You know, so where am I at geographically? How old am I? You know, this is not going to really hit right now, so it may just be down the road a bit. So, yeah. Yeah, right.
I want to touch on that a little bit because I've been mulling that over in my mind for years. And the best book I read on that was just last year. It was called Unprecedented: Can Civilization Survive the CO2 Crisis? He talks to that issue, but the poor are going to be suffering the worst. But I bring back to what you can do individually and collectively. You can influence things collectively, but there's a book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey, that I read the year after I was laid off from a company I'd been with for 17 years. And he talks a lot about human behavior. And the one thing I remember about that book is you cannot control what other people do. You can only control your response to that behavior, and you can only control what you do. And I made myself a note here, the first response I think we should have is what we're doing today. We're educating ourselves. We're discussing it. And we're discussing not only, collective response, because that you don't have as much control over, but also individual response. What behaviors? And I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is we have to, you can be a climate change denialist, but the biggest reason is you're a denialist because we're addicted to fossil fuel. Everyone in here is. And the U.S. is really, really guilty of it. I picked up this yesterday at the Arboretum, this Yes, Stop Global Warming, and I didn't, the front cover is Bill McKibben, It's Not Too Late to Save the World. I would like to see after the conference, you email everybody out with the list of books out front, and also this list of books. But okay. He's got an interesting section in here on China, and I showed it to you at break time. And they've also got a chart who's responsible in the 100 years of CO2. And at church coffee about a month ago, I had a teacher that's right away, he's kind of a denialist in the sense of, every coal-burning power plant that we take offline, China's going to build 2 of them. So what's the use? I went right past the childish part of that argument, because when you're a little kid and somebody broke a window, you say, well, I broke a window, but look what he did. He did something worse. He broke the window on your car. But I went right past it, and I told him, I says, okay, rather than using that as an excuse for just going ahead and being an energy hog and not changing your behavior, you both individual or collective, I made a comment to him about you have to look at per capita use. China is about 1/10 the per capita use of energy that we are, and you called it out in 20% of the world's population uses 80% of the resources. And so, rather than being powerless and considering whatever people are going to do and make excuses, I think we need to educate ourselves like we're doing today.
Yeah, thank you.
What behavior changes do we have to do, individual?
Right. Yeah, great. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Today I've heard 2 comments that have struck me. One of the comments, initially you said that climate change, or to curtail global warming, demands dramatic changes in lifestyle. And then this gentleman said that the poor will suffer the most.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm finding a dichotomy there, because if you're looking at changes in lifestyle, the people that rely on the benefits of coal, automobiles, things that we use every day in our life, electronics, etc., all would be a suffer if we curtailed the use of coal. So we wouldn't be able to use as much automobiles or whatever. Is that correct?
That's
am I
correct.
right? If I'm
That's
saying
correct.
that. Okay. So since the consumers, the biggest consumers, are the people generally with the most money,
Right.
would really the poor suffer the most? Or would it be the middle class or the upper class
Well,
that would suffer? It's just
Good. Okay, good point. So the kind of suffering that we would talk about. So, for example, if I drive my car 50 miles a day, or rather, and so I cut back and I only go 20 miles a day, which means that I probably have to take a lower paying job that's more local rather than, so I'm going to suffer for that. So that's the kind of suffering that I think you pointed to, huh? Where the poor suffer most is actually even staying alive. You know, their crops are going to get wiped out because the temperature has gone up and there's no longer enough rain to keep the crops growing. So the brunt of theirs is like survival rather than level or quality of life or standard of living kind of thing. So actually, all of these calls from Pope Francis, etc., are, we need to change how much we consume and cut back on that in ways. That's okay. With Sally McFaig, she's actually, when we talk about Christianity and let's say in the last century, a lot of, we talk about separation of church and state. So in many ways, what the larger culture has done is tried to keep Christianity, that's your own spiritual life. It's what you do. You go to church on Sunday and then go home, but try to keep that out of politics and economics. You should not be messing in that kind of thing. So salvation is through the redemption of your soul. That's what really matters. But she's countering this, saying that the Eucharistic banquet, everyone has the right to the basics of existence. And the Christian view of the abundant life stands in tension with the market forces that endlessly preach a consumer utopia for the privileged few. So if that consumer utopia for this, 10-20% at the top keeps going on, it's actually depriving the poor because it's changing the climate where they live. If you're in that sub-Saharan Africa, it's a short time, they're just not going to be able to live there. So they end up migrating, and we know the problems if you migrate. Where are you going to get a welcome, etc. So global warming is a religious issue, and sin is public and economic. It's not just private and sexual. So she gives a few rules here, as if you were living in a household. The basic rules of ecological responsibility would be take only your own share, clean up after yourselves, and keep the house in good order for others. So how do we get that? You probably do that in your own house, but how are ways that we see what we do in our own house actually impacts the house in your state or in the country or in the world at that point? So Pope Francis talks about the technocratic paradigm, where technology has given those with knowledge, and especially the economic resources to use them, an impressive dominance over the whole of humanity and the entire earth. When he goes through these sections, he's careful to acknowledge that obviously there are a lot of wonderful things that have happened through technological progress, and he affirms the benefit that they've conferred. But there's a tendency to believe that every increase in power means an increase in progress itself. So the more power that we have over nature, is actually a good thing to have. So the fact is that contemporary man, is the way he states this, has not been trained to use power well, because of our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. I'm sure people that I've had some friends that talked about being in boardrooms where they've seen these large corporations debating something, but when an environmental question comes up, it's really not. It's put by the side in many cases. So the social cost of what they're doing to carry out their business is not being factored into what they're doing. Now, it's difficult to generalize, but this is you probably hear anecdotes yourself, and you probably maybe know more about it. But, yeah, please.
But isn't that really, the reason they do that is because the people who invest in that company are demanding a higher standard of living.
There you go.
So that's why they do it, so all of us, in fact, are responsible.
Good point. Yeah, so it's if there's one of these writers, if they actually said, we're not going to burn any more coal anymore, we're just going to stop right here, the amount, it's like trillions of dollars in terms of your balance sheet if you own that coal mine. And that is put on the stock market, and it probably is assets that actually fund, many retirement funds are actually invested in this. So if you did that, the ripple effect of this would be, if you did it all at once, it would be really.
How do we get out of this trap? Most of us.
That's.
What I just said.
Yeah.
How do we get out of this trap of more is better? I mean, that's the real.
Yep. Yep. I think that's right. Yep. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Anybody who has any assets, a couple months ago we met with a financial advisor because my mother-in-law had died and my husband and I had inherited some funds that she had. And I asked the financial advisor if these funds were in a socially responsible. She defined social responsibility merely in terms of tobacco and alcohol.
Okay.
And I said, what about oil and coal? What about clean energy? I want to know if this, wasn't even on the radar. She looked at me like I was from the moon. So anybody, I think if people have, I don't know a lot about these huge investments in accounts and everything, but I think we have to, as a people, start saying, what are these accounts invested in? Because she wanted to know if we wanted to take them out or just leave them where they were. And my husband's like, well, just leave them where they were. And I said, well, wait a minute, where are they? I want to know about them. She couldn't even tell us where they were. She was the person managing the account. She could not even tell us.
Yeah.
Well, I think we all have to be asking those questions. Because like you said, lots of people have pensions, retirement accounts. We don't even know what those things are invested in. And even when they're labeled socially responsible, to them that means they're not in alcohol or tobacco. And I'm like, whoa, what about oil and coal? It wasn't even on the radar. So
Okay. I think, Tony, you wanted to talk.
I take every opportunity I have to promote microcredit. That is, investing in poor people. Generally, we go into stocks and bonds, and like Roseanne said, we don't know what it's really going for. But I know that we all know that we have to help the poorer people on this continent, our common home, in microcredit. Microcredit is simply a small loan to a small person for a small period of time. And it helps them to get their kids to go into school. It helps them to, on their own free enterprise, take care of their own lives. It's teaching them how to fish. And the popes are for it for many years now, and I think we should catch up with our popes and start thinking about that too. It's okay to invest in the rich people, but quite often the rich people have enough already, and I think it's time that our poor people get a chance at life too. Hey, thank you for this opportunity to say that.
Okay, all righty. I think you had...
3 talks on it.
Okay. Yeah, we have a question here. Great.
My only other comment is, are we willing individually to reduce our income and assets to move our monies from the high-producing coal and those other kinds of companies where we don't get the return? And the thing comes down to, are we individually willing to do that?
Right.
And that's what we all have to ask ourselves.
That's correct.
If we're willing to do that on an individual basis.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Yeah, there's a couple back here or whatever.
You know, we're talking about the dichotomy of using coal because it benefits our own pocketbooks. And yet, when you showed that DVD about that Indian reservation in Montana,
right,
the eastern part of Montana, and I have friends who live in the eastern part of Kentucky, western part of West Virginia. It's no different down there than on the Indian reservation. And they're mining all that coal, but they are living in the depths of poverty. So the incongruity between our talking about coal is benefiting all of us when it benefits those who are closest the least.
Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah. Great point. There's a question back here.
Thank you. I would just like to reinforce what this woman talked about, asking questions with investment, and then this fellow with investing in the poor. What she said takes me back to when apartheid was very much alive in South Africa, and people were thinking about social justice and so on, and even when I would buy certain things, I would look at, you know, does this company, Kodak, for example, invest in South Africa and support apartheid? Or are they doing things to try to change it? There's, you know, nothing is a black and white answer. And then in terms of investing in the poor, I find and really love and appreciate the food co-ops, cooperatives, the truly cooperative ones. There's one out there that's very corporate, and I boycott, but like, in Minneapolis, where I live, Seward Co-op, the Wedge, and so on, almost everything is fair trade produced and marketed. You know, if possible, each of us as individuals can look at when we make a purchase, even of food, is it local? Is it produced? If not, for example, your coffee beans come from Africa or South America, Central America, does it come from cooperatives where the people receive fair and just wages? So there are many ways we can start the conversation, like just asking the questions, you know, planting seeds in people's heads who have no idea of the vocabulary or concepts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
That's a good topic for your next
Yes, I guess so. Tony, you wanted to jump in?
A lot of people do not plant a garden because they say it's cheaper to buy it at the store. And so the price factor is not considered because we are not realizing all the transportation it takes to bring in that food from California. So I think something has to be said about that vocabulary. It's cheaper to buy it in the store. It's not cheaper.
Okay. Okay. Great. Yeah. So you have more interesting questions than I have.
I'll probably talk real loud, so I won't be that. Last gentleman mentioned growing your own food is cheaper. I had this discussion with a gentleman I used to work with decades ago, and he said the same thing. I want to mention we have an economic system that's based on consumption, ever-increasing consumption. I read a book and actually I talked to the author in Northfield. Actually, I listened to the author. A book that was called The Party is Over, Oil, War, and the Fate of Industrial Society by Richard Heinberg. And this book title got my attention because the party was over in college when the keg was dry. That was the analogy I made in my mind. But anyway, Richard Heinberg, very, very knowledgeable in terms of the crisis we're facing, economic also. He predicts toward the end of the book that we are going to see the energy-led collapse of the global economy. He predicted about 5 other things,